Saltburn is not a good film, but it is an interesting and divisive film, which is why, even though I found it lacking, I think it's worth talking about. Why is it polarising? What did it get right and wrong? The film tries to explore compelling themes like style versus substance, envy and power, obsession and madness, and the British class system and privilege. In this video, I want to analyse what the film was trying to do, why it often failed, and how it could have been improved. And I also want to bring a personal perspective to add a slightly more unusual and hopefully informative dimension to commentary about this film. Specifically, while I've never studied at Oxford, I did study for a year at the University of Cambridge, which means I have some thoughts and potentially insights into how class manifests across Oxbridge and what it can be like to study at an elite British university when one is, perhaps a bit like the protagonist in Saltburn, not one of the elite. So let's examine the film, and spoilers lie ahead. Saltburn is billed as a black comedy thriller, and it polarised audiences as some viewers think it's deep and communicates intelligent ideas, and others, like myself, I'm afraid, think it's a hot mess which is trying to say and do lots of things and which has occasional moments of flair, but which is mostly just a fancy disaster. Also the working title of my autobiography. Saltburn is set in 2006 and follows a young man named Oliver Quick who shows up to study at the University of Oxford and immediately finds himself on the outside looking in. He's not one of the in crowd, and he lacks the graces, the speaking style, and the inside knowledge of students who seem to have been born into this kind of privilege, the Boris Johnsons and David Camerons of England, for whom attending Oxford is an expectation rather than an incredible and unlikely opportunity. Oliver can't connect with his lecturers the way his posher classmates can. He lacks the points of connection based on shared social circles and shared unspoken behavioural norms. His peers mock his clothes and his manner. One of the earliest shots we have of Oliver, a shot and a motif that is repeated throughout the film, is that of him looking through glass at a gaggle of happy, confident undergraduates. This looking through glass motif does a good job of summing up the class-based theme of being close to the scene yet not really part of the scene. At a place like Oxford, or indeed Cambridge, one often sees lots of wealth and shiny people and objects and possibilities, but one cannot always gain access to them. Just because you're at the same university, it doesn't necessarily mean that you share cultural and class-related touchstones. A person like Oliver can get a glimpse of what the British 1% looks like and can admire and even aspire, but he'll likely always be looking at this world through glass. A more intelligent film could have honed in on this experience, actually, and offered some interesting ideas about how much scholarships and equity schemes really do in terms of redistributing opportunities and social capital, and whether more active efforts should be made to help students of all backgrounds feel that they belong. Consider the Rhodes Must Fall movement, for example. But that's not really this film's focus. So Oliver's living an ostracised nerd experience at Oxford until one day he has a serendipitous encounter with the posh boy to end all posh boys, Felix Catton, a wealthy and popular aristocratic student. Oliver lends him his bicycle, as Felix's bicycle has a flat tire, and the two become friends. Felix develops interest and sympathy for Oliver upon learning more about Oliver's difficult and underprivileged upbringing. Subsequently, when Oliver's father dies, Felix invites him to Saltburn, Felix's family estate, for the summer, so that Oliver can enjoy a reprieve from his difficult and upsetting hillbilly elegy of the UK style home life. Yet what Felix doesn't realise is that he is not living in a Merchant Ivory film, but rather a film with strong echoes of the talented Mr. Ripley. Felix, I'm sorry. So where did Saltburn go wrong? And how could it have done better? And what does it teach us about storytelling? I actually thought the film's first act was pretty good, mainly for its multifaceted depictions of Oxford and life there, and of the challenges that someone who feels like an outsider might experience while studying there. But before talking about Oxbridge outsiders, I want to explain why the second and third act of this film failed, and what could have been done to tell the story differently, and potentially more successfully. In the second act, we meet Felix's aristocratic family at their big country estate, and we see Oliver try to ingratiate himself with them and adopt their ways. Yet their shallowness and lack of self-awareness defies belief, and thereby undermines the film's capacity to be appreciated as something serious. Felix's family members are such over-the-top characters that mocking them or criticizing them as a viewer feels too easy and too obvious. Take his cringeworthy mother, played by Rosamund Pike. Her insincere dynamic with her hopeless friend, played by Carey Mulligan, becomes a low-running joke throughout the film as a way of humorously depicting how insubstantially this character relates to other people. Yet the character shows herself so obviously to be so blatantly insincere that she swiftly becomes a caricature rather than a character. This means that Saltburn robs itself of the opportunity to make more insightful, satirical observations about the rich because it's constantly operating on this very superficial, caricature-like comedic level. Of course, caricature can be entertaining, and I sometimes really enjoy superficial depictions of the British 1% in comedy. I love P.G. Wodehouse's writing, which gently sends up eccentric British aristocrats leading idle, pointless lives in the interwar period. Yet Wodehouse's writing and TV adaptations of his works like Jeeves and Wooster function because they know what they are, unlike Saltburn. Wodehouse deliberately wrote light comedy. He wrote about silly rich people getting into silly situations in their big country houses. His characters are superficial caricatures because they are vehicles for light comedy, not nuanced commentary. Similar depictions of silly wealthy British people can be found throughout the Blackadder television universe, for example, and these work too because the show's tone is light. In Saltburn, however, we are introduced to Wodehouse-esque characters, but in a commentary setting rather than a comedic one, and they just don't offer enough complexity to be worthy targets enabling biting satire. What's also disappointing here is that the film actually set up two clear opportunities for developing more insightful commentary about race and class involving Felix and his family, but it ultimately didn't really explore either. Missed opportunity number one is about how Oliver wants to be more like Felix, but Felix arguably also wishes in some ways to be more like Oliver, and the film alludes to the second half of this equation, but barely explores it. Early on, Felix pushes Oliver to talk more about his traumatic childhood, and there's almost a greed to which Felix pries for this information. It reminded me of the idea of trauma porn, which writer Brittany Johnson describes as media that showcases a group's pain and trauma in excessive amounts for the sake of entertainment. She adds, trauma porn is created not for the sake of the marginalized group, but instead to console or entertain the non-marginalized group. In keeping with this theory, when Oliver finishes explaining his traumatic childhood to Felix, Felix says very earnestly, "That sounds fucking awful." And then he adds, "You're a fucking inspiration. You're cool." Interesting. What this short exchange shows us is that Oliver's trauma makes him seem more real and authentic and interesting and valuable in Felix's eyes. Perhaps partly because Felix has lived such a sheltered life. He finds something appealing and alluring in the suffering of others. And Saltburn would have been way more interesting and complex if it had explored this challenging theme. Wealth cringe is real. The latest British Social Attitudes Survey by the UK's National Centre for Social Research revealed that in 2022, 32% of Britons in the top quarter of household incomes identified as working class. I'd argue this suggests not just an affinity to one's own roots, but also a desire to identify with the working class, in part because no one really wants to be labelled out of touch or elite, not in a time when many people talk so openly about wealth inequality, evil landlords, checking your privilege, and eating the rich. And so, in Saltburn, although Felix seems very comfortable in his skin, the perceived sexiness and coolness and interest factor of trauma is one thing he does not have. So personally, I wish the film had toned down its unsubtle shift into very conventional thriller horror mode, and instead told a dark, funny, textured, complex story about wealth cringe, which is a fascinating social phenomenon, and a very sensitive one. Ergo, a rich social phenomenon to explore more through challenging pieces of art. And the second great and underexplored opportunity the film had for exploring race and class, more insightfully, was through the character of Farley, who is a biracial member of Felix's family. He is part of the family, but as a cousin he isn't quite part of the inner circle. I would have liked to have seen an entire film from his perspective. He's cocky, charismatic, and a little insecure, and his ongoing connection to Saltburn depends on him playing by certain rules. In a parallel universe, he could have made a fascinating main character. But alas, this was not to be. This film is unfortunately confused about what it's trying to say, and its tone is inconsistent. The understated social commentary of Saltburn's first act clashes with the superficial satire of hyperbolic landed gentry characters in the second act, and with the abrupt descent into all-out thriller and horror themes in the third act. Some films blend genres well. A good example is The Dressmaker from 2015, starring Kate Winslet, which incorporates cowboy and western motifs into a drama about small-town Australia. I would argue, however, that this film works because its characters show depth and consistency, and the film's narrative progresses in a believable way. Saltburn, by contrast, seeks to be inventive by blending styles and motifs and genres, but ultimately creates a messy pastiche because its characters and their motivations are too shallow to be believable, which consequently robs their actions and the story of real momentum. The result feels disjointed. So, what happens in Saltburn's third act, and why does it fall short? Well, brace yourself. Oliver is revealed to actually be a psychopathic liar who was middle class all along and lied about his family's sob story. He then gradually kills off the cat and family members undetected while remaining ingratiated with the remaining family members to the point that the final one standing names him heir to Saltburn before he murders her as well and dances naked and victorious through the empty mansion. The ending reveals that he deliberately orchestrated everything. His whole persona was a lie, going back so far that he even deliberately punctured Felix's bike tire, which prompted their meeting in the first place. How this film portrays Oliver tells us something about effective storytelling. There are strong parallels between this film and The Talented Mr. Ripley, which is both a book by Patricia Highsmith published in 1955, and a star-studded film from 1999 based on the book, which I thoroughly recommend not watching late at night. The Talented Mr. Ripley is a psychological horror film about a man who realizes almost by accident that he is a brilliant impersonator and con artist. He then gradually becomes embroiled in his own growing web of lies, to the point that he must ultimately kill the object of his own affections, someone he actually cares about, to keep his secrets and remain a free man. Saltburn is also reminiscent of, amusingly, Ingrid Goes West, a 2017 black comedy starring Aubrey Plaza as a stalker who meticulously crafts a new personality and lifestyle in order to befriend the Californian social media influencer with whom she is obsessed. I'd argue that both Saltburn and Ingrid Goes West fall short of The Talented Mr. Ripley, and here's why. Both, and particularly Saltburn, seek to capture what makes Ripley a great story, but they get hooked on the style rather than the substance. More specifically, both films emphasize plots built around deception and associated hijinks, but they fall short on characterization. Ripley works in part due to external suspense, sure. Questions like, will he be found out, and what shenanigans will ensue as he seeks to keep his mask intact. We see how, at the start of the film, Tom Ripley isn't a cold-blooded killer with a plan. He's just a boyish Matt Damon who takes the opportunities that come his way, telling a few white lies here and there, and then sinking deeper and deeper into this world of deception, kind of like the characters in the 1998 thriller A Simple Plan. Ripley's deception brings him closer to a luxurious, aspirational lifestyle which he comes to covet, and before too long he's in too deep to back out, even if he wanted to. But unlike in Saltburn with its gimmicky "he was a psychopath all along" ending, or in Ingrid Goes West, where Ingrid is unhinged from beginning to end, we see Tom Ripley start out as almost normal and then turn into someone unrecognisable and monstrous. This film is haunting and resonant because it charts the fall of a person who might, under other circumstances, have led an ordinary life. It prompts viewers to ask, on some level, how far would I go to defend a lie that snowballed into a bigger and bigger lie? Do I too have the capacity to become a monster? And Ripley's tale is also nuanced and harrowing, not least because of the final scene where he realises his web of lies can only stay intact if he kills his lover Peter. Saltburn tries to do something similar through Oliver realising he needs to kill Felix, but it falls short because we don't see sufficiently how remorseful he is over killing Felix, as, despite this plot twist being visible a mile away, the film only really reveals that Oliver killed Felix at the end as part of a montage of Oliver's crimes that merely served to cement the final, unveiled version of Oliver as a hardened psychopath. We're not really with him through any character growth, as, similar to how Saltburn's residents are blind to Oliver's true nature, the film also tries, not very successfully, to hide Oliver's true nature from the audience too. The film's final scene is actually pretty great because it shows Oliver figuratively naked for the first time, taking off his mask at last. He's also literally naked as a symbolic gesture towards the figurative nakedness. And what makes the scene compelling is that we are finally seeing the true version of Oliver, because none of the other versions were authentic. Yet, although this final scene is thrilling in a way because it feels transgressive and sinister and stylish, it also comes after such a disjointed couple of hours that it isn't a satisfying payoff in the context of the wider film. Indeed, I'd argue that the greatest and possibly unintentional irony of the final scene is that it is completely emblematic of style over substance. The film's first and second acts seriously question the problem of how style is often valued or admired over substance in intellectual and interpersonal contexts. Ironically, however, the film ultimately ends up abandoning this tension and kind of celebrating the sinister and glorious successes that one can attain through being who Oliver ultimately ends up being, namely all style and performance and shallowness and zero substance whatsoever. In that sense, I guess he is the perfect candidate for inheriting Saltburn. And, ironically, the film's final scene is, it too, incredibly successful on the style front, but still sorely lacking in terms of substance. Is director Emerald Fennell perhaps signalling, without even fully realising it, that flair and style always win over substance both on the film's narrative level and also on the film's production and critical filming level? I do enjoy the irony, but I'm not sure the film was actually setting out to lampoon itself. I've got more to say on Saltburn, but I've written a long script about this film, so I've decided to split this video in two parts. So, cringeworthy though it is to recommend this, do subscribe if you want to see the second half of this video essay. I'll be talking about a couple of details that other critics don't seem to be focusing on quite as much, like the use of Zadok the priest in the film. I'll also be talking about separating art from shock value, and of course a couple of personal anecdotes and observations from my own time within the Oxbridge educational environment. But in the meantime, as always, thank you for watching, have a beautiful day, and if you do have any friends who reveal themselves to be psychopathic liars, don't tell them that they can still sleep over at your house and that you'll talk about it the next day. If Oxford boys were all as stupid as Felix, the rich really would have been eaten a long time ago. Posh or poor, look after yourselves.